The long-awaited call to the member for Bowman.
Well, thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I mean, one of the few Labor MPs who, when he runs out of material from his carefully prepared and rote-read speech, actually gives it a go from behind that lectern and just keeps talking for another couple of minutes to at least avoid the embarrassment of being a shadow spokesman who can't even get to his time. This is a person who has been highly critical of Howard government initiatives, which actually give us the finely balanced public and private health system that we enjoy today. And to hear him quoting the Private Health Insurance Association talking about projected losses from private health insurance belies the fact that tens of thousands of people downgraded their private health cover, and everyone in this room knows the extraordinary pain that privately insured Australians have been subjected to as a result of Labor's nickel and diming of the private health system. But today we talk about the extended Medicare safety net. And I tell you what, if you had to find one piece of elegant social policy that takes on probably the most challenging part of health costs and health inflation, and yet hits up against those two barriers that we all learn about in Economics 101, that is moral hazard and adverse selection. They are the two challenges for this policy, so it's not easy. But of course it is easy if you're a Labor Speaker just to gloss over everything and go on about how Liberals are bad for poor people, and this sort of simple, visceral argument that, of course, most people have grown tired of. I mean, Australians in the main are hard-working, engaged people caring about their health and education, and they want a system that gives them choice. And the Medicare safety net and the extended safety net does just that, because it says to people, regardless of your background, whether you're a concession holder, a family tax benefit recipient, or simply a general recipient, there is a threshold there for you after which 80% of your out-of-hospital Medicare item-related expenditures will be covered by the government. And of course, for Labor to sort of slither in here and say to you, oh, poor people didn't benefit enough, belies the fact that 50% of procedures, in some cases more, are done in the public hospital system where there is no out-of-pocket expense. Of course it's for people who accrue an out-of-hospital expense on a Medicare-related issue. Okay? Now, of course, Medicare is used as a formula to fund a public hospital, but by definition you don't have an out-of-pocket when you go into a public hospital for an admission. Therefore, it's not of any great concern to you. The extended safety net is there when you accrue general practice, pathology, radiology, and of course out-of-hospital expenses in the private sector, and by definition, if you're privately covered, you'll accrue more of them. If you only visit a bulk billing doctor and a public hospital, you won't accrue much out-of-pocket. The average person will accrue around $50 in a year. You don't even get to the safety net to begin this discussion about an extended Medicare safety net. So please don't believe the rubbish that Labor peddles in here about rich people and poor people. The reality is we know about 11,000 Australians do hit that horror figure of $2,000 out of your pocket in health expenses. And for all the elegance and the brilliance of the Australian health system, we still do have a significantly larger out-of-pocket issue than many European countries. And it's obviously one that is made up for with a generous welfare system, of course. But we have to always be mindful of out-of-pockets. So the extended medical safety net, March 2004, was really, born of then Health Minister Tony Abbott, who found a solution to these periods in the life cycle where health expenses are out of control. Cancer, diabetes, assisted reproductive technology, and of course, having a baby. And so many people elect to have a baby in the private sector and found these enormous out-of-pockets that, of course, for following years simply didn't occur. It is an excellent way of solving that very specific problem. But what did we discover? And the previous speaker did allude to that. We discovered something called provider leakage, and that is that of all the money provided through the safety net system, how much of it ended up in the pocket of who? And we call that tax incidence in the game. And what we realised was that for certain areas that consumed half of the safety net, about 78% of it was going straight to doctors. And this brings up the issue of moral hazard. And this was that communication across the table that none of us are ever really present in unless it involves our own health, where a doctor will say, this is going to be expensive, but there's a safety net there. So I don't want you to worry. Once we go over this element, virtually all of it is paid for by someone else, your neighbour, the guy down the road, or the government. And so that's why the 80% element was there, to try and retain some form of price signal for the patient. But of course, what we found over time, those initial estimates that it would remain around 400 million over the forwards, reached 400 million a year. And it was just growing in a couple of those specific areas, as I mentioned, particularly obstetrics and ART. Now, it's okay to do all the analysis about who was benefiting from the safety net, But I want to tell you one thing. I want to say something pretty clearly. When you get out of bed, you don't say to yourself, not much on today. I wouldn't mind going down to the hospital to accrue some out of pocket. I mean, that's not the way I like to spend my day. People don't say, I'd rather not watch the State of Origin. I'd rather go down and see how much money I can rip out of the health system. People in hospital are there for a reason. They're there to get the best possible care that this country can deliver. Okay? So whenever we pause for a moment and look at out of pockets, let's remember this isn't something that we enjoy spending. It's not something that's put onto a credit card and you're told to go for your life. But the issue here is one that I mentioned, the second point, is the adverse selection. Is the adverse selection. This was the risk that in just a couple of areas, we had a real hint that in particular postcodes, for instance, there was a ballooning of these expenses. And there was, in fact, very little means for the government to contain it. There's two solutions to that adverse selection dilemma. The first was Labor's approach, and the second is ours with this legislation today. Labor's approach was simple. It was talking about chopping off and putting hard limits right across sectors, regardless of the people involved and regardless of what was happening. And this had caused enormous pain for people who were going through IVF. And look, none of us for a moment want to contemplate the notion that we would ever ration IVF for a needy couple. But the reality is we're virtually the only country that doesn't do it. That's right, we're almost the only country who doesn't put in severe age restrictions on IVF, nor limit people on how many cycles they can attempt. Virtually every other country does that. So it's already a very generous system. But the point is, if this was being consumed, if it was consuming a quarter of the extended Medicare safety net, then clearly it was just basically going straight out of the government's hands and straight into the pockets of providers. Now, I appreciate delivering healthcare is expensive, but that argument that there has to be some form of equality across the sectors was important. I know that the previous speaker very elegantly summarised the overview of the 09 report. He, in fact, virtually got it word for word. Sure helps when you're reading off notes. But whether you've got diabetes and you accrue $369 of expenses on average, or cancer at $1,000, the whole point of this system is you need something way more nuanced. You need the ability to identify where you're getting provider leakage and act. And that's what the bill is today. The bill simply says that a minister can keep a watching brief through the department on movements that are often quite fast within the provider community in health and actually act with an instrument that's very, very similar to a disallowable instrument. Parliament has the opportunity to disallow it, sits over on the other side for the required number of days and gives everyone the chance to see whether they agree or not. But that allows you just crack the walnut without the sledgehammer. Just pick up that one little area where there's concern when we're overviewing through professional services review how the money's spent and to get it fixed. It's a nuanced solution. But let no one on that other side of the chamber traduce the idea of a Medicare safety net, because that is one of the great reforms after Michael Woodridge's 1990s private health insurance reforms that have shaped the nation. And it does disappoint me somewhat that we have a Labor Party that's always, stating how they are the sort of the guardians of the health system, but when they're in power, it's fascinating how little they can do with the health system, and how when we come back into power as a coalition government, all the problems that were challenging us and just evolving in 07, like the Medicare safety net blowouts, are still there for us to catch when we come back into power. So for all of the protestations about how much you love and care for the health system, this is a party that can nickel and dime private health insurers, make life tough for them, come along to eye surgeons and cut their rebate in half for no good reason whatsoever, only to have it backflipped again when, Kevin Rudd was trying to survive in his prime ministership, and he said, jettison the barnacles, find me a solution to this one. Airlift out of the red zone the health minister, who's getting beaten up by a tiny band of eye surgeons who are saying, for goodness sake, what are you doing to blindness when you halve a cataract rebate? I mean, this was Labor reform at its heart. Just halve a rebate. That seems like a quick way to save some money. This is how you have a better working health system and you save the money at the same time. A system that allows people still to get the access to health services, but not to let individual sectors get away from us. Look, there's a certain conflict for me, as a former specialist, but I've got to be honest. We don't just exist in a world, Deputy Speaker, where we set the price and everyone has to pay it. No, it's not that simple. In city areas where there's plenty of provision of services and plenty of other specialists like me, of course they're looking over the shoulder seeing who's charging what. There's plenty of mechanisms and competitive tensions around price, even for a doctor. And the second point that I want to make is that there is a communication between doctors and patients and the receptionist on the front desk all the time about price. So don't for 1 minute believe the Labor rhetoric that this is just doctors charging whatever they want. Sure, there were areas where people knew that the Medicare safety net was going to cover 80% of the expense, but this is the solution. an ability to individually isolate an item or a sector and address it. And that's what will actually save us more money in the Medicare safety net to make it more generous into the future. Before I sit down, it should be mentioned, we've reduced those thresholds for eligibility down to $600, $700 and $1,000 respectively. A small thing that is not insignificant thing in the budget but hasn't received enough attention, and that will make it even more certain that people who have these precipitous expenses can be looked after by the Medicare system. Look, we can bat backward and forwards who's the best friend Medicare's ever had, but there's one thing for sure. We've found that over the last 6 years there are a lot of abortive attempts at improving the health system, which really led to nothing. In this bill, and I commend it strongly, and I'm delighted to see the other side supporting it, you have a common sense, targeted approach to a piece of legislation that has served this nation well. I hope the extended Medicare safety net will continue to.